Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on alignment of investments to climate scenarios from policies to practices. So first of all, we would like to thank WWF for having supported us, having organized with us this webinar. So I now show a brief presentation as an introduction to this afternoon. So first of all, the agenda of this webinar. I will introduce the topic of post-COVID recovery and decarbonization, which is very important for us as the Italian Sustainable Investment Forum, ItaSIF, in order to avoid that the actual crisis linked to the pandemic do not overshadow climate change issue. So after we will have Matteo Leonardi, Policy and Climate Advisor at WWF, that will illustrate European climate policies and the role of investments. After a roundtable moderated by Elena Bonanni, journalist at ETicaNews, on climate alignment disclosure. So we would like to provide some practical insights, some examples of methodologies in order to align investments to climate goals, and in particular mitigation goals, so to the Paris Agreement objectives. We will have also, the agenda also includes a Q&A session, so please feel free to write your questions, remarks in the live chat session. You can find in our website. So let's start with my presentation. So as concerning post-COVID recovery, we as ItaSIF have identified 8 actions that the Italian government could commit to in order to orient European funds through the Next Generation EU plan towards both economic recovery, decarbonization, in order, as already said before, in order to keep together economic needs, of course, of recovery, and the importance of tackle seriously and urgently climate change issue. So I will briefly illustrate these 8 proposals ItaSIF addressed to the Italian government. For the first one is regarding taxonomy. So the European taxonomy of eco-friendly activities can be used to identify the strategic sectors within which to invest in terms of public investments and also, of course, private investments. As we know, public investment might also foster private finance. So we suggest to use this classification in order to prioritize the economic sector and the economic activities to be fostered, to be encouraged and financed through the Next Generation EU plan. So the second proposal concerns sustainable finance instruments, sustainable finance tools that can speed up the shift of investments funds in order to achieve the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, while steering the just transition towards a more inclusive and environmental friendly economy. This is also a very important point for us. So to keep in mind the social aspects related to climate change in terms of just transition, in terms of risks for also human health, related to climate change in terms of migration, climate migration. So it is important to keep in mind that climate change has also social aspects, and with specific regards to this proposal, we attention the government on the just transition and on the use of sustainable finance instruments in order to foster the transition towards cleaner and climate-friendly economic model. The third proposal is about climate benchmarks. So the recently introduced climate benchmark at European level. We suggest to align public finance instruments with climate benchmarks. So both the Paris-aligned and the transition benchmark. We also have stressed the importance of green bonds and the importance of issuing sovereign and also regional green bonds. As you know, Italy is among the 10 most important countries in terms of green bond issuance, but Italy hasn't emitted any sovereign or any public green bonds yet, and we stress the importance of this kind of instruments in order to raise funds for key green transition projects. For example, in sectors such as sustainable infrastructure, zero emission public transport, sustainable mobility, energy requalification and adaptation of public buildings, allocation of revenues to the forestry sector, and for decarbonization of farming and livestock breeding. Also, social bonds are key. As already said, it is important to always keep together environmental, social, and also, of course, economic dimensions. So we encourage our government, the Italian government, to issue also sovereign and regional social sustainability and transition bonds that can be used to boost the strength and efficiency of the healthcare system. Of course, a need that has become particularly evident in this pandemic time. Also to invest in education, so to make the school system more inclusive and bridge the digital divide. It is also important in terms of climate change in order to involve a broader part of the population and to make the population understand the importance of addressing climate goals. So to invest in the educational system, add jobs, especially for the young and for the women, and to retrain staff in sectors that will be most heavily impacted by the transition. So again, just transition and inclusive aspects. So we know that young people and women are the most affected by the COVID crisis in terms of losing their job, in terms of more generally the participation, the active participation to the economic and social life. So our sixth proposals is about public budget. So we suggest to modify budget constraints and debt caps in respect of the issuance of sovereign and regional green and social bonds, which would help enhance debt quality. So it's important, of course, to reduce our debt, public debt, but also to work on improve its quality. In addition, a regulatory and policy framework should be established to further develop the market for the green and social bonds issued by companies and financial organizations. So, of course, not only public issuance is important, but also the private one that might be further fostered and encouraged. Then we also suggest concerning the private sector, private financial sector, to encourage the provision of sustainability-linked credit lines that are specific credit lines where advantages for the borrowers are included, advantages that otherwise are can be assured only if the borrower reaches specific sustainability targets that must be previously identified, must be measurable, and must be monitored and assessed. So it's a way of encouraging the borrower, so the company that borrow money from a lending institution to be more ambitious on its sustainability goals, and of course also to acknowledge some advantages, financial advantages to these achievements, because there are actually solid databases that show that indeed sustainability, ESG leaders, companies that are ESG leaders are also less risky as investments for the investors, and also for banks, for lending institutions. So our last proposals concerns impact investing. So we suggest the Italian government to support impact investing through initiatives that can benefit the environment and society, with, of course, both measuring the impact produced by the initiative, and also initiatives that can guarantee a financial return. So this is very important in order also to change the culture of public action, in order to make it more accountable, more based on accountability and on actual assessment of impacts that are generated, positive or negative, through the supported initiatives and for the investments. So this was our commitment in order to orient European funds towards decarbonization and social inclusion. Now I leave the floor to Matteo Leonardi from WWF for his presentation. Please, Matteo.
Yes, here I am, and nice to have you all here today for this workshop, which is focused on disclosure methodologies that WWF is promoting with the adoption of minimum requirements. Just let me spend a few words in order to put the subject of today's workshop in a broader context of the decarbonization policy and targets. And I want to start by underlining that in a few weeks' time, we are entering a key decade for decarbonization. 2020s up to 2030. 2030 will be a crucial decade for the transformation and for the startup of the necessary innovation to achieve the long-term zero-emission targets. There are going to be processes, companies that will be able to catch up the challenge, to survive and to prosper. There are going to be processes and companies that will fail and will not be there in the long term. There are going to be countries that will be effective and efficient in catching up the challenge, and there are going to be countries that will struggle behind the climate targets. Climate targets that are there and that are defined by a scientific scenario the content of CO2 in the atmosphere is not a variable that we can choose. It's a variable that is chosen by the chemical composition of the atmosphere. So what we need to do is to adapt into a given period of time. We have some margin, we have some flexibility, but not that much. And in this view, so if we take 2020, 2030 as a key decade for the transformation of the industrial processes and the policies supporting this transformation, we are particularly concerned in Italy, because in Italy we see that there are some weaknesses that may jeopardize the economic development in the long run. To start with, Italy is still a highly industrialized country. This is normally an advantage, and it is still an advantage. But most of the industrial processes that Italy is strong in are very much in the front line of the climate challenge. I'm talking about steel, I'm talking about cement, I'm talking about the car manufacturing and oil refineries. Italy is still the second European producer second European producer in cement, and second European country in terms of refinery capacity being installed. Up to now, up to the 2020s, Italy has been able to achieve climate targets, not because of clever and advanced policies, but most likely because the ordinary energy policy was very much in line with climate targets. Development of renewables, development of energy efficiency, and the role of natural gas have been overlapped the Italian energy policy with the climate targets. But in the new decade, in the 2020, this will be not enough. This and working in the electricity sector may be enough to achieve the 2030 targets, but will not be enough for the long-term targets, for the zero-emission target. For zero-emission target, we necessarily need to touch industrial processes, and we necessarily need to touch fossil fuel from natural gas to coal, with the difference that in 2025 coal will be closed down. The oil transformation has still started, whereas our country is still strongly reliant on natural gas. And natural gas has been one of the national champion to start our industrialization. So this is to say that we think that Italy needs a new climate policy in the decade that is just starting in a few weeks. Another relevant characteristic of the Italian development is the presence of the small medium enterprises. Again, small medium enterprises they offer a good opportunity for the alignment with the climate targets, as small medium enterprises are the core of circular economy, and they offer the flexibility to design a more resilient economy. Still, small and medium enterprises, if not supported by adequate policies, and if not supported by the possibility to access credit, may not alone face the risk that the innovation connected with the decarbonization policy is necessary. So it is difficult to imagine the capacity for small, medium enterprises to achieve climate targets, if not necessarily supported by policies and credit availability. In this context, we have the COVID crisis and the opportunity which Next Generation EU EU and the climate, the European budget is offering to member states. We believe that the next generation funds and the ordinary EU budget offers a unique opportunity in order to speed up the transformation that we have identified as necessary in order to adapt the Italian industrial and the small medium enterprise development to climate targets. And the opportunity consists in a role of this public money to be injected in order to support the risk connected with innovation. We have a state that has a long tradition of intervention in the economics and in the national industrial sectors. We need this presence to be progressive and to be innovative, and not to deny the long-term net zero emission scenario. Now, why are those images, those ideas that I'm sharing with you, why are they relevant for today's seminar? Well, I think because whatever it is a policy, whether it is an industrial process, a startup, a new technology, the sustainability connected with this is not cannot be evaluated uniquely in today's context. A new infrastructure, a new process cannot be seen uniquely today in a short-term scenario. It has to be forward-looking. So this is a key word that I would like our audience to focus on today's seminar, forward-looking. So are we able to assess our decision, our investment, our policies, our processes, not only in today's climate policies, but in the longer term climate scenarios, which are not always translated for different reasons into policies. This is what the reason we have called Pacta and the colleague from Sweden to introduce you some methodologies that comply with the minimum requirement that Ian is going to talk you about in the next in the round table. So I think there are methodologies that are able to give you and to assess investment in a forward-looking scenario and not only in a short-term one. One word that very often is on the table is this greenwashing. We have to be pay attention to greenwashing or not greenwashing. I think we need a new word. Greenwashing is not a good definition nowadays. I think greenwashing nowadays, the word greenwashing very much connects with the idea of cheating or hiding. We are not talking about this. We are talking about the capacity to grasp the climate change challenge. So are we able to verify if the processes, the companies that we are investing in will be able to be there in 20 years' time? This is not this is a wider challenge to be assessed, and this is why we need a strong scientific approach. This is why we need to acquire skills in order to assess the likelihood of our process to be competitive in the long run in a climate scenario. This is basically my recommendation for today. So the recommendation is to focus on the minimum requirements that WWF suggests the disclosure methodology should adopt, and the presentation of two methodologies that we have believed have already included those requirements, and that by their adoption may give you a fairly good understanding of the sustainability of your investment, and in terms of alignment with the climate targets. So thank you for you being here today. I just leave the room to the roundtable session, and I do recommend asking a question to the experts that we have asked to take part to the workshop today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. And so before leaving the floor to the roundtable, so to Elena Bonanni, I just would like to also thank all the participants that are following us. So my colleagues told me that there were more than 260 people having registered for this event. So we are very happy about that. And so please, Elena Bonanni, journalist at ETicaNews, that will moderate the roundtable on alignment disclosures.
Thank you, Arianna. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to join this discussion, and I thank ItaSIF for this invitation. First of all, let me introduce to you our speakers. We will talk with Ian Vandermosten, Senior Sustainable Finance Policy Officer, WWF, and Martin Fleischauer, Head of Pacta, and Donald Linderyd, Sustainable Finance Project Manager, Financial Market and ESG Specialist at WWF. Let me start this discussion with Ian. Ian is a Senior Sustainable Finance Policy Office at the WWF European Policy Office. In this capacity, he coordinates the global WWF network efforts on portfolio alignment with environmental boundaries, and more notably, the engagement with European asset owners and policymakers on climate alignment disclosure and commitment. So welcome, Ian. I know that you have a presentation. We will have a first round of presentation, 10 minutes each, and then we will have more discussion with some questions. You will outline views, WWF views on minimum regulatory requirements for climate alignment disclosure. And this aims in particular to inform the ongoing development of technical standards and detailed metrics for the implementation of the disclosure regulation that we know will be course in March 2021. So you can start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. I was asked to put this on full screen. I hope you can see this. So thank you very much. I will indeed today be presenting some findings or recommendations that we have included in a briefing that we finalized a few days ago on minimum regulatory requirements for climate alignment disclosure for financial institutions. And the goal of this briefing is basically to provide our views on what regulators should include in climate alignment disclosure regulation for financial institutions. We see there is a growing number of processes ongoing that include such climate alignment disclosure regulations, and we would like to inform such processes through this paper. And we are notably at this point focused on the EU disclosure regulation, which, as you can see here on this slide, was adopted in 2019 and will come into force for all investors in Europe in March of next year. And this regulation has an article 4.2d, that requires financial market participants to publish and maintain on their websites, where relevant, the degree of their alignment with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So this is a climate alignment disclosure requirement. What we see now is that there is currently a process underway in which European supervisory authorities are developing so-called technical standards that provide more details to this general article in the EU disclosure regulation. And this is where they are thinking about what kind of metrics can we actually use or should be required for FIs to use in order to comply with this article 4.2d. And our 10 recommendations in the paper aim to inform this, and notably to encourage the EU policymakers to include forward-looking metrics. And this paper is also supported by concrete examples of tools and frameworks that showcase the feasibility of including such forward-looking metrics. There's quite a lot of ground to cover. I'll try to be brief and go through the 10 recommendations at a very high speed, but still trying to kind of cover the main things, so you have the gist of what's in our paper. I'd like to still spend a little bit of time on the first two recommendations, because these are the overarching recommendations. The first one that you see on the screen here is kind of our recommendations for the levels at which regulators should include requirements on climate alignment. We think there should be requirements for FIs to disclose climate alignment on the level of their portfolio for asset classes, on the level of sectors, in particular for highly material sectors, how they align their investments for specific high material sectors, but also include some metrics on the strategy and the activities that FIs are undertaking in order to align with the climate goals. Our recommendation states that financial institutions should be required to disclose against all three of these levels, but given some flexibility with regards to the exact metrics that they use to disclose against those levels. Very importantly, we also argue that these metrics should be forward-looking. And this links to the second recommendation in this paper. We in WWF do not believe that carbon footprinting is the most relevant metric to disclose climate alignment, for the simple fact that it is not forward-looking. It is based on past greenhouse gas emissions and kind of aggregating this from company to a portfolio level. It doesn't say anything about whether companies in a portfolio, and ultimately the investment portfolio itself, is moving aligned with the 1.5 degree targets. A company may have high emissions today, but it may reduce its emissions strongly over the next 5 to 10 years. That would not be captured by a carbon footprint. A carbon footprint also treats equally, say, low, like climate solutions such as renewables, with what we would call climate neutral technologies such as media or the care sector, social care sector. So it doesn't really capture climate solutions in a very robust way either. And I think finally, not many carbon footprint methodologies fully capture scope 3 emissions, which are emissions from a company up and downstream in the value chain. This requires taking some assumptions, doing some guesses, if you like, about what those Scope 3 emissions should be. So even though carbon footprinting is often kind of put forward as being a robust and mature measure, there is, if you want to include Scope 3 emissions, which are important because, for instance, for an oil and gas company or a car producer, it's the majority of emissions. There is still quite some assumptions that, for instance, the methodology provider would undertake or would need to take. So, in short, carbon footprinting is not a metric that we believe is the most relevant. What do we then suggest in terms of metrics? Like I said, we have 3 levels. So here you see what we suggest for on the level of the portfolio as well as on the level of sectors. Let's start with portfolio targets. We recommend, and like I said, these are metrics and targets that can be set on asset class level, for instance, your public equity or your corporate bond portfolio. What we recommend regulators to include are 3 types of metrics that FIs can then choose between that allow to do this disclosure on portfolio level. Temperature alignment scoring, absolute CO2 emission reduction targets, and EU taxonomy-based targets. And we have more detailed recommendations for each of these metrics. Unfortunately, there is no time here today to go into much more detail, but to be very brief, temperature alignment scoring methodologies are basically going to assess the temperature, the trajectory that your portfolio is on, putting one specific warming number to it. For instance, your portfolio is on a 3-degree trajectory compared to a scenario that is aiming for 1.5 or 2 degrees. Absolute CO2 emission reduction targets basically very briefly imply that you assess your finest emissions in a certain point of time, for instance, 2020, and then set the target to reduce those finest emissions over the next 5 years, ideally aligned, of course, with ambition required under Paris-aligned scenarios. And finally, EU taxonomy-based targets is that FIs start assessing their exposure to the EU taxonomy and set targets to increase that exposure over the next 5, 10 years, and so on. Moving on to the sector targets, this is where we recommend regulators to sort of identify what are highly material sectors or material sectors, and then require FIs to disclose their alignment with regards to those sectors. Here we include 2 metrics. One is product or production targets, and the other one is what we have called economic activity-based metrics. I'll very briefly again explain this. Production targets. It's a target where you aim to decrease the emission intensity of the companies in your portfolio for highly material sectors, aligned with Paris-aligned scenarios. So you could kind of take a 1.5 degree pathway for a high carbon sector, for instance, steel, and see how the emission intensity has to reduce over the next 5 years in that sector in order for that sector to be aligned with the 1.5 degree trajectory. For instance, expressed as tons of CO2 per ton of produced steel, and then you set a target to align the emission intensity of the companies in your portfolio with that target. A second metric is the economic activity-based metrics. These are methodologies such as Pacta that allow to kind of estimate your exposure to high carbon sectors in terms of economic units. It will, for instance, calculate that your portfolio is exposed to X megawatts of coal production or so many electric vehicles produced. And that is based on the production of the companies in your portfolio. And that will compare that to what should be an ideal exposure in those economic units under a Paris-aligned scenario. And then you can kind of assess what the gap is between your actual exposure and the exposure you should have under a certain scenario. So that's for the sector metrics and targets. I'll quickly go to the final type of metrics and targets, so the third level that we have included. This is more a requirement that we suggest the regulators to include that are based on the strategy and the activities that a FI puts in place to ultimately achieve alignment. This can be the strategy that it has in place to reach climate alignment. This can cover engagement efforts, engagement targets, but also disclosure of investment policies, explaining how they align with what is needed under a climate aligned or 1.5 degree scenario. My final slide, just to give you an idea, because this may seem like all very high level and maybe a bit technical. In the paper, we try to lead the reader towards concrete initiatives, tools, and targets that that showcase that these metrics and targets are actually already feasible to craft and to work towards as an FI and to disclose. And the good thing about this webinar is that the next speakers will already highlight in a concrete way 2 of these tools that we also have in our paper, the SBTFI temperature scoring tool and the Pacta assessment tool. So I think that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.
Your presentation later round. I found interesting several points just to remember, not to just limit to carbon footprint, which is maybe the most popular metric everybody knows, but it's better to go further. And also the recommendation for the engagement, disclosing engagement targets, number of breakdown conducted, and I found it very interesting. So now I would like to move to Martin. We saw also in Ian's presentation that he talked about Pacta, and so I would like to know more about how it works. Martin joined 2D11, if it's correct, as head of Pacta in August 2020. Pacta is a portfolio alignment tool developed by a multi-stakeholder group led by 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And Martin previously worked as a seconded national expert at the European Commission's DG FISMA, where he assisted in the implementation of the Commission Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth, notably the EU Taxonomy and EU Green Bond Standard. Prior to that, he worked at the Dutch National Bank, which was one of the first central banks to use the Pacta scenario analysis tool. And at the Dutch National Bank, Martin served as a special advisor to Frank Elderson on sustainable finance, and he helped launch the network for greening the financial system. So, Martin, please take us through some of the elements of the Pacta methodology, and as well as some of key components to consider when doing portfolio alignment.
Great, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here, even if digitally from my poor dark office in Brussels, where the daylight is already saying goodbye to us. I hope you can see my slides also okay. Yeah, basically what I'll try and do in the next 10 minutes is talk a little bit about why would you want to do portfolio alignment analysis? Because I think, why you want to measure something also has an impact as to what you might want to measure, which metric or tool or methodology, which touches upon, I think, also some of the key elements that Jan mentioned in his presentation. There's different levels and different tools, and they might give you different information. And I think it's always important for financial institutions to keep that in mind. I'll say a few words about how Pacta works from a practical point of view. I won't go in too much detail because I think you've already had maybe some presentations on this earlier in the year. And then I'll say something about some key components, I think, key principles that should underline portfolio alignment approaches. But maybe just to note also, what is 2 Degrees Investing Initiative? I mean, we are a think tank founded in 2012, and our mission is really to align financial markets and regulations with climate goals. But what's also important, we're not for profit. We don't do commercial contracts. We're not, in the business kind of selling anything. So I think this comes back to my earlier point, why measure the alignment of your portfolio to the Paris Agreement or to different climate change mitigation scenarios? There can be different reasons for that. And I think depending on the reason, you might want to have a different approach, or you might want to think about solving the equation in a different way. If you're thinking about managing transition risk and you want to make sure that your portfolio is on, a 2-degree path or a well below 2-degree path, then that makes a lot of sense. Portfolio alignment is a very useful tool for that. It could be enough to have the information on portfolio level, although it might be better to have the alignment information also available on a company level, so you can see where the risks are in more detail. If you're interested in portfolio alignment from the perspective of making a difference, of the perspective of contributing as a financial institution to real-world emission reductions, then it's likely that you're going to need company-level analysis, company-level results to see what the effects have been of some of your actions. But there can be different reasons for why you might want to do alignment. Maybe you want to disclose in annual reports. Maybe for some it's because governments are simply expecting you to do so. And I think it's always important to kind of be aware of that. The Pacta stands for Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment. And it effectively measures the alignment of your investments into equities or corporate bonds or your lending portfolio to climate change mitigation scenarios, to the Paris Agreement, across 8 climate critical sectors that together cover 75% of CO2 emissions. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Every tool has its limitations, if you will. I think we have to be open and honest about that. Pacta can measure the alignment for equities, corporate bonds, and corporate loans. And it can do so for your investments in these 8 climate critical sectors. So 8 sectors might not seem like a lot, but fortunately it does cover 75% of global CO2 emissions. The tool was launched as an online tool for investors in 2018. So you can go online, upload your portfolio, and you get an automated report. And we've worked in the past 2 years with a group of 18 global banks, including UniCredit, to also make this tool available as a standalone software for banks to analyze their loan books. Uptake has been just quite broad, just to give you a sense. Like I said, we've had this group of 18 banks, but we've also worked with BlackRock or Allianz, AXA, and others. And we've also worked with quite some supervisors and governments to apply Pacta from a supervisory perspective. Or recently, we've applied Pacta to the entire Swiss financial sector to measure the alignment of the Swiss financial sector. So what is the basic kind of principle of this climate scenario analysis tool, of this portfolio alignment tool? It's very, very simple. We've agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. From that, you can translate that objective into a carbon budget. And that, in turn, can be translated into what we call technology deployment roadmap and kind of phasing out roadmaps. That's, I think, very important because it touches upon the point that Jan made. For example, when he was talking about carbon footprinting, that can give you a good indication about, the CO2 emissions, but it treats, for example, a renewable power plant or an electric car the same as it would treat a carbon neutral activity. And I think when we're talking about alignment, it has to be forward-looking. It has to relate to actual scenarios. And those scenarios will say something about how fast we have to stop using cars with internal combustion engines, how fast we have to close coal mines, how fast we have to stop drilling for oil. That's the phase out, but it will also tell you how fast should renewable energy grow as a percentage of the total energy mix in the power sector. How fast should the uptake of electric cars, how fast should they be produced? And so those are the kind of scenarios that mostly the International Energy Agency produces. There are some other parties that produce similar scenarios. And I think that's an important element to bear in mind. So how does Pacta work in a nutshell? And again, it's I think we can spend even sometimes an hour and a half discussing the methodology, so I'll try and keep it short. A core tenet of the approach is that it's based on what we call physical asset level data. So that's this kind of information that you see here on the right side of the graph. We, over time, have developed a database of more than 230,000 physical assets. So at the level of the power plant, at the level of the coal mine, the oil and gas field. So you can see at the bottom, included are 2,000 coal mines, 22,000 oil and gas fields, more than 100,000 power plants. So we will know that, there is a power plant in Sicily, and it's a coal-fired power plant, and it's owned by Enel. And we'll know that Enel has another power plant here, and it's a renewable power plant. Or we'll know that it has a wind farm over there. So we have all that physical asset level data. We know where the steel and cement factories are located. We know how much they produce and who owns them. So we can kind of roll those physical asset level data. We roll that up to the owners and to the ultimate parent companies. And those are then the companies with which you are invested through your securities and loans. So we can then allocate that to your portfolio. So we are able to allocate the production of the company, or a part of the production of the company, to your portfolio. To give you an example, if you own, as an investor, one share of, like say Enel or Eni or something, or let's say Shell, because I'm Dutch, it's easier for me. Let's say you own one share of Shell, and there are 100 shares of Shell outstanding. Then you own 1% of Shell, and therefore you are allocated 1% of Shell's production to your portfolio. And we are then able, once we've made that picture of your portfolio, to assess that to climate change scenarios. And I think an important thing to note here is that it's forward-looking, because the databases that we are able to kind of bring together have the production plans for these companies, for these physical asset level data for the coming 5 years. So we know through permit requests and all these kind of things when a coal-fired power plant will be closed, when a new wind farm will come online, how much steel these plants are going to produce the coming 5 years. So we're actually able to look 5 years ahead and to see where is your portfolio going the coming 5 years, and is that aligned with a well below 2 degrees scenario from the International Energy Agency, for example. This is just to give you a sense of the type of outputs that you get on the right, as well as the sectors that we cover. And I think it's one thing I want to make clear, just to get a little bit more technical, is that the output you get is slightly different depending on the technology. So we distinguish between between sectors. We distinguish between sectors that have a technology roadmap and those that do not yet have a technology roadmap. So what do I mean by technology roadmap? Very simply, the International Energy Agency or others like polls, they prescribe by how much oil and gas we're still allowed to drill, or how much we're still allowed to bring from the earth, through upstream. They're saying we can still get this many barrels of oil out of the ground if we want to be on this path, or if we want to be on that path. So they're really prescribing how much we can still produce. That's why you see this graph on the production volume trajectory of your portfolio. They will also prescribe by how much renewable power as a technology needs to grow in the power sector. So that's why you will see this technology mix graph where, for example, this gray bar, the black bar is showing your coal exposure. and showing it through times and comparing it to market. So you will see the energy mix. Green is renewable, and that's the kind of technology mix coming from this technology roadmap. In some sectors like steel and cement and others, there is not yet this technology roadmap. They're not yet prescribing a certain technology in steel or cement because perhaps we do not yet have a zero carbon technology available at scale. And so there it's more based on emission intensities following the sectoral decarbonization approach. So there the principle is quite simple. We expect in the steel sector that they're going to produce still this much steel the coming 10, 20 years, but they're allowed to emit this much CO2, every year a little bit less. So then you can start to measure the emission intensity of that sector. And you can see, are the companies you're financing, what's the emission intensity for the cement companies you're financing? What path are they on, and what path should they be on if they want to be on a sustainable development path? So that's just to give you in a very few minutes kind of the basics of Pacta. Like Jan said, it really gives you, it can almost tell you by how many electric cars you are or are not aligned in your portfolio, for example. Just my final slide on this. So what are some of the key principles for portfolio alignment? I think key inputs are that you need scenarios, right? You need to actually have something that's forward-looking to see if your portfolio is aligned. You definitely need input data. And an important thing there is that the input unit should ideally be the same as the scenario unit. And that's why, for example, we work with these IEA scenarios, because they measure, by how much oil is still allowed to drill. And that's actually what we can get from these databases. So you can measure the same thing in the scenario as with our input data. But obviously you will need a methodology, because how do you allocate production to portfolio? There's different choices. And you need some output metrics. The theory behind portfolio alignment is also important, which is that if everyone does it, the equation solves. So if every microactor does it, the whole macro scenario needs to actually happen. Another important component, or another principle from our perspective, is that what you're trying to measure, the metrics, shouldn't be based on volatile financial asset price movement. So that's sometimes the case in some of the sustainability metrics that we see, where if the market value of if the market value of your investment changes a lot, then the sustainability indicator also changes a lot. But that is not really related. So that ideally should be filtered out. You should ideally not have a very volatile financial metric in your overall measurement. And then, of course, there's the question of how do you then sum it up to a portfolio level? And that's a very interesting research question as well. In Pacta currently, we do not, we assess the alignment per sector, because we have not yet found a way to say, if you are misaligned in the auto production industry, but you are aligned in the power sector, how do you add that up? Misaligned here, misaligned there. Are you then, there's more research that can go into that, and other tools do it, but sometimes our thinking there is, if you cannot sum it in a meaningful way, then don't do it. Focus on what you can measure in a meaningful way. That's just what I wanted to share in what I hope was the 10 minutes. Thank you.
This concept of forward-looking, that to me is the really key point, and it reminds us that climate change needs to be addressed acting now, but looking in the long term. So very interesting. And now, just to finish our first round, I would like to talk with Donald about science-based targets. He is going to give us a brief introduction of science-based targets finance tool. And Donald comes from the asset management industry and has spent 15 years as a portfolio manager and equity analyst. He then moved on to Bloomberg for 4 years to develop IT solutions for asset management and mostly focused on quant and ESG solutions. He brought the asset management and system development experience with him to WWF Sweden in 2019, where he is a core team member of Science-Based Target for Finance and has managed the project of developing the SBTi finance tool for company and portfolio temperature rating. So, Donald, thank you for being with us. Let us know something more about Science-Based Target and Finance tool.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to try to move this into about 10 or 12 minutes or so and take you through the science-based targets and focusing on the temperature rating or temperature scoring tool that we've developed. So just to give you a few numbers, science-based targets for financial institutions, or science-based targets rather, has been around since 2015. And currently we have around 1,000 companies outside of the financial services industry that have said we are going to set science-based targets. 520 of those have so far set those science-based targets and have got them approved, validated and approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. About 60, just over 60 companies, financial institutions have also said that we will set science-based targets, and they have about 2 years from they do say they commit to this to actually do that. And that number may not seem that great, but keep in mind that we just launched the framework for finance in 1st of October this year, so they've had about 2 months to do that. So there's quite a lot of growth coming in from financial institutions to set science-based targets. So just going to spend a minute on what the framework is first, so that you get the picture. So the SBTi finance framework includes methods and criteria and tools and guidance. And the guidance includes is your guidance on how to use the methods and the criteria and the tools in order to set science-based targets and to communicate that to the marketplace. When we launch this, I think we're going to talk mostly about the temperature alignment or the temperature scoring solution today. And I just wanted to highlight a comment from, or a remark that Mark Carney, the ex-Bank of England and now governor and now the boss of COP26, said at our launch. He was the keynote speaker. He said that this is the highest degree of sophistication to map that into form of portfolio temperature to judge the aggregate impact of the portfolio. Speaking of the temperature rating solutions that we do have, and he put that on a 4-grade scale where this rated highest, and TCFD, for example, at the bottom of that scale. Not taking away anything from TCFD, as that is as also an important initiative, obviously, naturally. But that gives you, we were obviously very pleased with that comment. So within the SBTi finance framework, we do have, this is just as Pacta is a forward-looking solution. We use similar-ish methodologies for sectors with no current sort of technology. So we use the sector decarbonisation approach for real estate mortgages and electricity generation project finance, for example. We can also use this for corporate instruments, equity, bonds, and loans. But what we're going to talk to you about today is sort of the portfolio coverage, which then builds out into the temperature rating approach. So I want to spend much more time on that. But the portfolio coverage approach is very simple. It essentially says all of your companies in your portfolio, how many of those have actually set a science-based target, i.e. have had their GHG emission reduction target validated and approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative. As we saw, we have about 520 of those companies currently in the that have had their targets approved. So if you have 10% of your portfolio invested in some of those companies, you obviously have a 10% coverage currently in your portfolio. What we require for you as a financial institution to set a science-based target is for that number to be 100% by 2040. So by simple math, by a linear sort of appreciation of your coverage, you should then have a 4.5% roughly increase of your coverage per year. So when you set a target 5 years out and say, hey, by 2025, we have to have at least a 32.5% coverage of companies that have set science-based targets. So by doing that, we can include all sectors in this. This is a quite crude but very efficient tool to move companies along and make sure they do set science-based targets. It is an engagement solution that you can identify the companies that haven't set a target and obviously engage with those companies and make sure they do. And naturally, if that doesn't work, you can obviously shift around your portfolio and divest, but we obviously recommend engagement first and foremost. The temperature rating builds on this because for a number of reasons, but one reason is that 500 companies currently isn't that much, but there are a number of companies out there that have actually set targets and communicated these targets publicly and said, hey, we are going to reduce our emissions by so and so much by this date. There's about 4,000 companies roughly that have done so currently that we can gather. And so what we do is essentially then evaluate these companies in the temperature rating tool. We evaluate these companies programmatically and say, hey, is this a good enough target? And if it is a good enough target, then we then take that target and convert that into a temperature. So let's say that a company has said that we're going to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2025. We use IPCC scenarios, there are SR15 scenarios, and via regression map that target to an SR15 scenario and say, okay, that actually means for this type of company, for this type of target, it actually means, say, 1.8 degrees. So if all companies in the world did the same thing, we would have a 1.8 degree world with that type of GHG reduction. So that gives us a target on the company level. Then we aggregate these up to the that gives you a temperature on the target level. Companies can set a number of different targets, so we need to include all of those targets. So they can be various time periods, they can be for various scopes, for various divisions, and various activities in the company. So we aggregate those up to company level, and you get a company temperature score. And obviously, the beauty of this is that it's quite easy to say that a company with a temperature score of 2.2 degrees is obviously not aligned with a 2 degree or a 1.5 degree world. So they obviously need to do more. And then we can back engineer that and say that, okay, that means that you need to reduce your emissions by X. So we take that up to the portfolio level as a last step and say, okay, so your portfolio, when we aggregate this up, is then a 2.6 degree portfolio, for example, if you want to set a well below 2 degrees or a 1.5 degree target for your portfolio, then you obviously need to reduce that temperature in a linear fashion over the next 30 years to get to that target by 2050. So this may sound complicated, but it is actually quite simple. What we did in order to help you out in doing this is that we created a tool to help you do this. It's an open source solution. It allows, and we set a number of objectives in order to create this tool. And one was that it was going to be an open source code base that can be integrated into any infrastructure and that can use any data from any data provider. It should be transparent so that you can follow from the corporate ambition to the portfolio temperature score and see exactly the steps of the calculation all the way. And it should be secure so that no sensitive portfolio data is compromised across your network. So it essentially, you can run it locally on your machine if you want. And more importantly, maybe, is that it should be scalable so that you can do this for your tens, hundreds, thousands of portfolios in your organization and aggregate it up on an institutional level. But it should also be a workflow tool, and this is quite key. It should be a workflow tool for portfolio managers and for financial analysts and ESG analysts like risk management, so they can use this in their day-to-day activities. It shouldn't be a compliance tool that we pick out of the bottom of the compliance manager's drawer once every year to create some report. This is an aid in your security evaluation and selection process, and obviously with your engagement work with these companies. In order to do this, we put together a development team. I led that team, obviously including all the members of the Science-Based Target Initiative. We enlisted Ortec Finance and OS Climate to help us actually write the code. We had a number of data service providers working with us to make sure that we could actually live up to these objectives here of any infrastructure and data agnostic and transparent and data security and such. And we also included Asset Owner Alliance in this development work to make sure that we develop something that they can actually use and that they want to use. So if we look at the structure, what we develop is, if you want to be mean, is the calculator in the middle, the red bit in the middle here, which is taking input from pretty much any data source, converts that into a temperature score on the target company and the portfolio level, and that portfolio could obviously be an index or a sector or whatever aggregation level you want, and then shoves that out to whatever reporting solution that you use, whether that is a Bloomberg terminal, the ISS climate report, or Agentum's solution or MSCI solutions. For your own analysis, but also to submit, obviously, to the SBTi for setting your own targets, or for Paris alignment disclosure that Jan was talking about a little bit earlier. The last minute is going to be quite quick because we have a few slides to go through here. What can we use this for? Naturally, for calculating temperature scores, but more importantly for modeling impact of engagement on your temperature score for the portfolio, so that you can plan your engagement strategies and create an action plan for this. This is the 4-step process that I've just been through. We take the targets, we aggregate those up on company level, on portfolio level, but more importantly, we do scenario analysis so that we can see where I should spend my time in order to be most efficient when it comes to engagement. So this is the output that we can see from one version of this solution. This is the Python version that you can run in Google Colab online. If you want, log on to our website and just click on the link and you can run it there. It's a test case. So what we see here is the portfolio temperature score on a medium-term time frame for scope 1, 2, which comes out at 2.6 degrees. For scope 1, 2, and 3 comes out at 2.9, let's say. And we also get the portfolio coverage, 35% of the portfolio is covered. Bear in mind, this is totally random data. So there's very little sort of real-life data in this particular example here. And we can drill into this and see what this actually means through heat map and saying, hey, Asian industrials is an outlier here. Why is that? Why is communication services, for example, across my portfolio so high? Why does that score above 3 degrees? What can I do about that? Well, we can list our companies and look at the contribution and the ownership percentage of these companies. And here we have two companies there that are where we yeah.
I need to ask you to go to your conclusion to have more time, 5 minutes later left to have a chat with everybody. So we are
sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm just at the sort of the last slide here. So what we have here is we own quite a bit of these two companies. They contribute a lot to our temperature score for the portfolio. So we say, what if I engage with these companies to set a 2-degree target? Then we run that analysis, and we can see the actual before was a 2.6 degrees on scope 1, 2 level. And now with the scenario, it gives us a 2.4 degrees. So this is just an example to show you what you can do by just modeling two companies and saying, hey, what if I engage with these two companies? Is that time well spent? Obviously, you need to do a lot more, but this solution provides you the tools in order to analyze that. You have a reporting solution in this as well, so that you can report this to your stakeholders and to the SBTi, all anonymized data, so that you don't have to share any exact holdings in your portfolio. So just to sum up here, this solution is essentially for analyzing and modeling and reporting for Paris alignment, for target setting, and for engagement strategies. I'm going to finish on this slide. Is obviously, where do I start? All the companies that we had listed and that we work with here are standing by and helping you with either data and or tools for you to be able to use this solution, this methodology, and the tool in order to work out your temperature score for your portfolio and for the companies in those. Thank you. Apologies for running over.
Thank you, Donald. It's very technical presentation, but I think that if there is somebody from the audience that wants to go deeper in what you presented, it can reach you and ask for details. And I also want to remind people, our audience, that they can send us questions with the blue button on the right hand of the screen. And let's go with the second round, just 5 minutes answer for each, because I've got 3 questions I want to ask to our speaker. I would go back to Ian to ask him. Hi, Ian. But I was just wondering, what can stakeholders in Italy do to ensure that forward-looking metrics are included in the financial technical standard of the EU disclosure regulation?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very relevant question. I think what we maybe taking a step back, these regular technical standards, what we call the RTS, that have to complement the EU disclosure regulation, which was adopted in 2019. So they're currently working on these standards, and it's European supervisory authorities that are doing this, and they published a draft of this for consultation back in April. And at that point, the kind of the metrics that they had included in these RTS, they were only focusing on carbon footprinting. So, I mean, I think we have gone over this in the various presentations that the carbon footprinting is not the most relevant indicator for measuring or disclosing climate alignment, because it's basically like we said, it's not forward-looking. It doesn't say anything about the future performance of your portfolio or the companies in your portfolio. So that was pretty concerning in our view, and the reason for why we have drafted the paper that I just shared you. I think some of the reluctance that comes from regulators that are working on this file is that they feel that the tools or methodologies that are forward-looking are not yet mature enough to be included in regulation. And of course, I mean, any methodology that you use, and I think Martin referred to it when he was presenting Pacta, it takes a certain assumptions, it makes certain decisions in order to come to some understanding of what the future performance of a company or a portfolio looks like. That's a natural thing about forward-looking metrics. And actually, if you look at how the financial industry uses and accepts forward-looking metric for non-climate related topics, such as metrics on, say, future revenues or credit rating of companies, these are also forward-looking metrics that are broadly used by the financial industry. But that also is, in which these methodology developers or service providers also take certain assumptions, and they're not always right. Sometimes they also make wrong assumptions, but still it's used. It's by the financial industry, so it's not so different for climate metrics that we're presenting compared to existing financial forward-looking metrics. So how can stakeholders contribute then? Is by basically showing that they are using the tools such as the Pacta tool or the SBT FI temperature scoring tool that were just presented, or other tools that are forward-looking. Using them, disclosing the results, and making clear to policymakers that actually it's something that you can use, that you can disclose, that is relevant, and so that they see that it's getting a support from the financial industry, and then this will give them confidence to include these kind of metrics in the final regulation. Now, I have to say, if we go specifically to this file, that the timing is extremely short to do this. We don't have a year to kind of start testing these tools and disclosing these results. Of course, it has been done to some degree by many financial institutions, but what could be potentially something that can be done by this group or maybe the Forum on Sustainable Finance is to give some kind of signal to EU policymakers that say, hey, we support the inclusion of forward-looking metrics in the regulatory technical standards that you're currently working on, in the form of a letter or a public statement or anything of that kind. I think is can be very impactful, because there is people in these institutions that want to do this, that want to include this kind of forward-looking metrics, but they think we're getting lots of pushback. It's helpful that WWF is formulating clear recommendations, but I think if we get this signal from various areas and various countries, various people, and in particular the financial industry, this could give impetus to this process and lead to ultimately having such forward-looking metrics in the EU regulation.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. And now I would like to ask Martin, you explain us how to manage a good portfolio alignment, but what about the real world impact of portfolio alignment? Does that have an effect in terms of emission reduction in the real economy?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's something that comes back to one of my earlier, one of the points I made at the beginning. Why would you want to measure alignment, and what does that what can you conclude from that? And I think I just wanted to show this kind of picture here is that, let's say that this is kind of the economy that you're financing, right? And you can see in gray that that's the part that you're financing. And we can maybe say your portfolio is on a 5-degree path because you're mostly financing coal-fired power plants and some polluting cars. I think what's important to bear in mind is that just because, you might move to a 2-degree world, your portfolio might move to a 2-degree aligned portfolio. You're now financing, a windmill, electric cars. Does that mean anything has changed in the real world? When you're going from, if your portfolio is going from this to this, has there been any emission reductions in the real world? And I think that is not so easy to conclude. And more research on that is needed. I think a lot of financial institutions are interested in really making a contribution to changes in the real economy. And I think that's really great. That's really, really positive. Like also Jan said, engagement is a crucial component in that. But I think it's something to bear in mind when we're talking about portfolio alignment, is that, just because you've shifted your portfolio, which is great for, let's say, transition risk, or it's great to know that your portfolio is on a sustainable path. And if everyone were to do it, then we can say we're getting closer to those scenarios. But it's not so easy to then conclude that something has changed in the real economy. And more work on that is needed. And I just wanted to show this one picture here, in that we did an analysis of the alignment of the Swiss financial sector in 2017 using Pacta, but also in 2020, or like their investments from 2017. And we also analyzed the Swiss financial sector today. And what you can see in the blue bars is that the exposure of the Swiss financial sector to coal power has actually gone down. You can see, right, this bar here, this first bar, it's a bit bigger than this bar. So actually today, the Swiss financial sector is less exposed to coal-fired power capacity, which is positive in terms of portfolio alignment, although they're not on a Paris-aligned path. But if you look at how that came about, which is the middle part, I think it's just interesting to share. These are these were the planned additions of the companies that were in the portfolio in 2017 in terms of coal power. So they were planning to add only a little bit of coal power, the companies that were in the portfolio then. This is how much they've actually added. So they've added a lot of coal power to their mix, these companies. What the investors have done is they've invested into some new companies. They've reweighted some companies, and then they've divested from a whole group of power companies that have a lot of coal-fired power capacity. And so you can see that the main driver for this more aligned portfolio in this case has been divestment. And again, we're not saying, that's not a judgment call as to whether that's good or bad. From a portfolio alignment perspective, it makes sense. But it does mean that perhaps you then cannot necessarily say that you've also contributed to lower real-world emission reductions. And so I think that's an important distinction to bear in mind when we talk about alignment versus kind of what we would call impact. And so I think, more research on that topic is really needed. How can we connect what financial institutions do to actual emission reductions in the real world?
And let's finish with Donald. We talk about science-based targets and the finance tool, but my question is, what is the point to use the SBTi finance tool when only 500 companies have set science-based targets? That doesn't take us very far, does it?
Good question. So 500 companies is for the portfolio coverage, which may not seem that much, but I'll come on to why that is. But that's one of the reasons that we expanded the coverage by programmatically evaluating about 4,000 company targets with the temperature rating solution. And if you look at that, and if you map that to the S&P 500, for example, that is about 50% of the S&P 500 that we can currently map. It's about 30% of the MSCI ACWI that we can score based on these targets. Importantly, any company that hasn't set a target is given a default score. That means that you can score any company, any assets, power plants, ship foundries, data centers, anything. 100% of your universe can be scored with the temperature scoring solution. So it's not at all the 500 companies there. So, but the main point is not the exact temperature score of this solution. From our perspective, the point is to identify companies with no targets or targets that are not ambitious enough to engage and influence with them to see the benefits of setting targets. And that is key to building a sustainable business model for the future, both for the companies in your lending and investment portfolio and for you as a financial institution. And that's the point for companies and financial institutions. This type of analysis is crucial for financial returns and climate goals alike. From a philosophical perspective as well, this is not a perfect solution. We have never said it's a perfect solution. There will never be a perfect solution. But we need to take action today. We cannot wait for a perfect solution. Time is just way too short for that, as Jan pointed out. And besides, if we were having 70,000 companies or 1 million companies, so we have 75% coverage in our portfolio, we wouldn't have this conversation. We would be much closer to 1.5 degree world. So the fact that not tens and thousands or millions of companies have set a target yet simply means that there's currently a lot of low-hanging fruit to be picked, companies for you to engage with and influence to have real reduction in emissions.
Thank you, Donald. So we are running out of time, but I thank you all our speakers, and I leave room to Arianna to go on with our webinar.
Thank you, Elena, and of course, thank you to all the speakers. It was really interesting, and I think we provided detailed insights to our audience. So first of all, I remind again to use the blue button on the right if you want to ask questions. Also, if you have remarks, for instance, if you have already tried some of the methodologies we have mentioned, or if you plan to use one of them. So please, we are interested in your feedbacks. And we also have two short speeches already planned from the audience. So first of all, I would leave the floor to Valeria Piani, Strategic Engagement Lead and Sustainable and Impact Investing Team at UBS AM. So Valeria, you can share with us your own experience concerning alignment of investments to climate scenarios, and so you can mention an initiative you are taking part in. So please, Valeria.
Thank you, Arianna, and I'll try to be brief, as we have been hearing a lot of presentations already. I'm sure you want to hear the questions from the audience as well. But my intervention or contribution is really just about raising awareness on a tool that we've been involved in collaboration with IIGCC, the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change. It's a group of institutional investors like us interested in taking action on climate change in Europe more specifically. And they're also behind the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, which is the largest collaborative engagement on climate change that we're also part of. So the initiative has launched a net zero framework on Paris alignment portfolio very recently. It was launched in August in 2020 this year. Several institutions have taken part in this collaboration. There were more than 70 investors involved. We as UBS Asset Management have been leading the conversation in relation to listed equity and fixed income, but there were equally working groups related to real assets and other asset classes. So the invitation is really just to have a look at the tool itself. It's a framework. It does not go into specific methodology as we heard about Pacta or the science-based target initiatives, which are great methodology to use. It just provides a overall framework of reference, especially for asset owners and pension funds. They want to take action to align their portfolios to the Paris Agreement, but also helps them to have a conversation with their investment managers to then implement these commitments. It looks at actions to decarbonize, so efforts to really decrease the level of emissions included in the portfolios, but also actions to increase the level of investment in new solutions, which means more efficient technologies or renewable energies, for example. So it really encompasses the two options, and also goes into specific steps that investors can take from a governance point of view, starting from a commitment to be net zero aligned, to more specific actions related to setting targets at portfolio level. Those could be on intensity emission targets or absolute level of emission targets, and also percentage of revenues of assets under management related to solutions. It goes into strategic asset allocation and scenario analysis, and some of the pathways we've been listening today about with Pacta and science-based target initiatives could be one way of doing it. Then it looks at asset class targets. So for specific asset classes, what are the metrics that you can take? And then relevant actions for alignment. And there's a lot of, for example, role to be played by engagement. If some of your companies are contributing quite a lot to increasing the footprint of your portfolio, then engagement is the solution to try to help management to align their strategy to a net zero scenario. And it's not just engagement with companies, but it's also engagement with policymakers. The framework itself goes into details on what types of pathways can be used. It looks at 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees, and it recommends that the pathways look at differences in sectors and differences in regions. But I will not spend more time into the details. You can see the link to the framework now in during the live stream, but you will also receive it in the thank you email at the end. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I think it's just a great tool to review.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you very much. So I think it is a interesting and useful initiative. So as already said, we will provide the link also in the follow-up email for the audience. So if you are interested in going into more details, you will be able to do that. So now we have also a brief intervention from Marco Ghilotti, who is Senior Business Development Manager at Pacta Asset Management. So please, Marco, maybe you can also share with us your own experience as asset managers concerning climate alignment of investments. So we can't hear you. Maybe you should unmute, or don't know if there is a... Okay, I still can't hear you. I don't know. I asked my colleague. No, no. Okay, you can hear him well. Okay. No, sorry, Marco, we can't hear you. So I don't know if there is a trouble with your internet connection, or anyway, I mean, we can go on, and the technical staff will be reaching you and trying to solve this problem. So we also received a couple of other questions from the audience, and again, we invite you to use the chat session to ask questions. So there is a questions concerning the forward-looking aspect of these methodologies. So in what at what extent we can trust companies' targets, so their projections in the future, as already mentioned by Martin. It's not uncommon that companies set too ambitious target that after they are not able or don't want maybe to reach. I mean, they set targets in order to also attract investors and clients, but then they can't really reach them. They are not serious enough in reaching them. And these questions also mentioned the fact that, for instance, in CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project questionnaire, often companies report more on climate-related opportunities than on climate-related risks, in order to show a better image of themselves, an image that might be not corresponding to their reality. So this is one question. Maybe, I don't know, Martina, you can answer. Another question, maybe, or I don't know, maybe also, okay.
Sure.
Another question okay, maybe you can answer first, and then I will ask the other question for the other speakers, please.
Yeah, sure. And I think also it would be interesting to hear maybe on this question from Jan or Donald, but I think, so it's a very good question, right? I think there's always the question of what are the targets that they're setting maybe for 2050? And what are they doing today and for the coming few years? Are they actually changing their production? What is their capital expenditure? What are they actually doing on the ground? And I think those two need to complement each other. So I think if you look at the SBTi FI approach that Donald mentioned, it gives you that more 2050 view. What are the targets? Maybe what are the 2030 targets? And are those targets good enough? I think the Pacta methodology, and of course I'm a little bit biased, but it's based on the capital expenditure plans of the companies. So what are the companies actually going to do the coming 5 years? How many electric cars is Ford going to produce the coming 5 years? And so this is that's why I think it's important that the tool that we have, it's based on this granular asset level data. And that is the data from that. It's a mix of kind of what companies report, but also business intelligence, also permit requests. If you want to build a windmill or a wind farm or a solar panel in the coming 5 years, or you're going to retire a coal-fired power plant, this is, you have to file for permit request, you have to notify the government. All of that information is kind of taken on board into that database. And so it's actually a way of kind of, that this is maybe their target, and what are they at least going to do for the next few years? It's a way of kind of comparing the two. So I find that it's actually quite complementary. There's this kind of big initiative, CA 100+, where a whole group of investors is kind of engaging with more than 160 companies to make them more sustainable. And we are one of the contributing partners on the technical side. And what we try to do is exactly that. So using, for example, Transition Pathway Initiative, what are the targets that the companies have? And then using the data that we have from Pacta on what are they actually going to do the coming 5 years, and does that correspond in a way to what they're saying they're going to do? That's why I think this granular approach is important, because just because Elon Musk tweets that in 5 years, in 2030 or 2050 they're going to have 7 million electric cars, then check what they're doing on the ground. So I think it's a very good question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I know also Donald would like to react on this question, but I maybe also ask you two other questions we have received, then you can choose, I mean, which one to reply. So someone asked about the ESG quality data issue. So you have already mentioned it, and also ask a comment concerning the European ESG platform project initiatives. So how do you see this project, and how to put together investors' needs on detailed and accountable data, ESG data, and the difficulty some companies experiencing, especially small and medium enterprises in providing this data. And another question about Paris-aligned and transition benchmark introduced at the European level. If you think that they can be a useful tool in order to align a portfolio to climate goals. So, as said, I mean, these are all the different questions. You can react on the first one, and then, I mean, maybe Ian or also Matteo Leonardi, maybe they can reply or comment on the other.
Sure, absolutely. So, just on what extent we can trust companies' targets, I totally hear that, and that's something that we have discussed intensely within SBTI as well. It is an issue, naturally. Currently, what we're doing within SBTI is that we're essentially saying, yeah, we trust the companies, but what we are looking to do is and we hope to incorporate this throughout next year, throughout the framework and throughout the methodologies, is to introduce performance tracking. So whatever a company says that they are doing, they obviously have to report in to the SBTI if they have set a science-based target and have that approved. They need to report at least once a year on what their performance is, and we can obviously take that data and see, okay, is that actually aligned with what they say and what they're going to do? We hope to have that ability to do that next year, maybe early next year even. But more importantly, we don't allow companies to set too far ahead targets to avoid things like this, so that they need to come back to us quite often to restate that targets. So for all the methodologies other than the portfolio coverage and the temperature scoring, you can only set a target that is between 5 and 15 years long. You can't set a 20, 50 targets for that to get an SBTI approved targets. For temperature scoring and portfolio coverage is even more narrow, because that is obviously just an engagement solution where you can only set a target that is up to 5 years. So that requires very frequent sort of checks to see whether that temperature, whether those targets actually are aligned with what they're saying they're going to do, whether that performance is aligned with their initial target. So there is work being done on this. We have released this because we think that it is currently robust enough as a starting point. But as I said initially, it's not a fully fledged finished product, but we need to obviously improve this, and it will be improved over next year and the years ahead, I'm sure. On the ESG data quality issue, I don't know if my colleagues here want to pitch in on this, and same thing on the Paris-aligned benchmarks. I think ESG data quality issues has always been an issue. I think it will always be an issue. Regulation is going to help us some way, but I think it's also quite important to remember what Jan said initially here, is that we are actually in the financial markets are quite used to working with data that may or may not be of high quality in terms of guidance, or in terms of estimates, or in terms of forward projections of any sort. That's sort of what we get paid to do, and that's why we take on that risk from others who don't want to take that risk. So I think that the market needs to understand that, and obviously regulators can set some boundaries for how you report data and such. But I think that the market also needs to find their own way in interpreting this data, just as we do with a balance sheet, or with a income statement, cash flow statement, or guidance from companies, and how to interpret those, and how to rate companies based on that, and such. I think that I think I stop there and let the other my colleagues come in.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that we have Marco Ghilotti from Pictet that might be online now. We have solved the issue, apparently, hopefully. Okay, I still can see, or okay. So if you want to, okay, I can't hear you. Maybe another quick try. Okay, no, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. So maybe there are some issues still. So last remarks, Ian, if you want to add something on the different points, input from the audience, or even if you want to add a general comment, please.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can quickly touch upon two of the points that were raised. I think again on the targets of the companies, and I think it's great. There's different tools out there that today will allow you to, on one hand, assess targets, and like the SBT tool, and on the other hand, allow you to go more to the asset level data and focus on technologies. And definitely, I think FI should try to use all those tools to get this understanding. But beyond the tools, of course, FIs in their engagement with companies, they can ask certain things, right? And what we have always pushed for within WWF through guides and such that we have published is that they should push for a comprehensive transition plan aligned with Paris climate goals, and that involves encouraging companies to set targets, but also explain how they are going to reach those targets, how they are going to change their capex, how they are going to increase their investments in renewables, how they're going to change the governance of their company so that it better addresses these issues, and such, how they're going to lobby for certain policies. So I think what's important for investors is to engage with the company with very clear demands. And something that you maybe can achieve in the first phase is for these companies to set a target, and ideally a target aligned with climate science. And the SBT tool can help you with that. But your engagement shouldn't stop there. It should also go like, how are you going to implement this target? And then Pacta can help you to assess this, or maybe the future iteration of the SBT tool will be able to do that. But it's really about engaging with clear demands and then pushing the company to actually go in that direction. Is, I think, pretty important. Maybe on the benchmarks, there is indeed the EU benchmark regulation that has come into force, and this has two types of benchmarks that that is going to, I guess, drive in the market of benchmark providers an offering of benchmarks that are more aligned with the Paris climate goals. And obviously, that's a very interesting development, because by creating this market, you will have an opportunity to maybe start benchmarking your own portfolios against these benchmarks, and also for passive investors and non-actively managed funds will be an opportunity to align investments more with the Paris climate goals. I think for us, it's a really good first step, and this regulation is really important evolution. Of course, ultimately, we would like mainstream benchmarks to include climate considerations and be aligned with climate goals, because that's when I guess we will really start shifting the markets. But especially, I think these new benchmarks that are included in EU regulation will definitely be an interesting development, and will also allow these benchmarks providers to build understanding and about what the Paris-aligned benchmarks look like. So definitely something that we support.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we are perfectly on time for closing our webinar. So thank you I would like to thank again all the speakers, and also of course the audience. And I think that we provide interesting insights on this important topic. And we as ItaSIF, we surely will continue. We will keep on working on these topics, on this issue, also because it is important that finance can play. It's important that finance play the role it can have on, let's say, orienting resources in order to achieve the transition towards a more sustainable model, in order to meet climate goals. Indeed, climate change has so far mostly been regarded as a risk or as an opportunity. So climate-related risks and opportunity are more and more developed, and more and more used. I mean, the reference to climate risk and opportunity are widespread now. But it is also important, as already suggested by the guidelines to climate-related disclosure introduced by the European Union with the introduction of the double materiality concept. It is also important to stress the impact. So not only the consequences that climate change has on economy and finance, but also the impact that finance and the economy has on climate in terms of worsening the problem of climate change, or in terms of enabling the solution, and in particular the mitigation of this issue. So we will keep on working on this topic. So I wish you a nice evening, and please be with us also in the next months. You will be receiving an email, thank you email with all the details concerning the video registration of the webinar, which will be published on our website early next week, and also with all other material, for instance, the link mentioned by Valeria, the presentations our speakers used. So you will be you will receive all this material in the upcoming days. So thank you again, and have a nice evening.